Beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the garden, Rusty carried off food each night to a place Jen and Michael never imagined. But when the floodwaters tore away the soil, revealing a chilling secret beneath Marley's grave, the real question wasn't what was he doing, but what had he uncovered? A child's tattered shoe and a strange hiss in the darkness awaited an answer. The little house sat quietly at the edge of the forest, its weathered wooden walls bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Beyond the back porch, where the garden stretched into a tangle of wild grass, stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. It was there, under that tree, that Marley, the old Labrador, had once ruled as king. A gentle giant who'd spent his days lounging in the shade of a small wooden doghouse Michael had built with his own hands. 3 months ago, Marley had slipped away in his sleep, his gray muzzle resting on Jen's lap as she stroked his ears one last time. Now only Rusty remained, the young, wiry Labrador who'd once trailed Marley like a shadow, learning to dig holes and chase squirrels under the old dog's patient gaze. Jen stood at the kitchen counter, slicing carrots for dinner, her brow furrowed as she glanced at the crumbs scattered near the table. It had started a week ago. Bits of food vanishing from the fridge, a loaf of bread torn open on the counter, a chicken leg missing from the plate she'd left out to cool. At first, she'd blamed the kids. Tommy, 8, and Lily, 6, who giggled and swore they weren't sneaking midnight snacks. "Mom, we're not that messy," Tommy had protested, pointing at the tiny crumbs trailing across the floor. But the evidence kept piling up, night after night, and Jen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Michael, leaning against the doorway with a mug of coffee, watched her with tired eyes. He'd been gone most of the week, hauling lumber for a construction job 2 towns over, and the house always felt heavier when he returned. "Maybe it's a raccoon," he suggested, his voice gruff but steady. "They're crafty little bastards. Could have slipped in through the back door." Jen shook her head, pointing at the muddy paw prints that snaked from the kitchen to the porch. "Those aren't raccoon tracks, Mike. They're too big. And look, there's something else." She crouched down, tracing a smaller, fainter mark beside the familiar shape of Rusty's paws. It was narrow, almost claw-like, and it sent a shiver up her spine. Rusty bounded into the room then, his golden fur catching the light as he wagged his tail and dropped a chewed-up tennis ball at Michael's feet. By day, he was the same playful pup they'd always known, chasing shadows, barking at the wind, tumbling over the kids in the yard. But Jen had noticed a change at night. When the house grew still and the stars pierced the black sky, Rusty would slip away from his basket by the fireplace. She'd hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint click of his nails, and then nothing, until he returned hours later, curling up with a sigh so deep it seemed to carry the weight of the world. "He's been like that since Marley died," she said softly, meeting Michael's gaze. "Like he's lost something he can't find." Michael set his mug down, running a hand through his graying hair. He didn't talk much about Marley's death. Not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't. Jen remembered the day they'd buried the old dog under the oak tree, how Michael had dug the hole in silence, his jaw tight, refusing her offer to help. He'd built that doghouse years ago, back when he was gone more than he was home, a quiet apology to Jen for leaving her alone with the kids. Marley had been her anchor then, his warm bulk pressed against her legs as she read by the fire, his steady breaths filling the empty nights. Michael had loved him too, in his own way, but he'd locked that grief away somewhere Jen couldn't reach. "Maybe he's just restless," Michael said, shrugging off the unease in Jen's voice. "Dogs get weird sometimes. He'll snap out of it." But Jen wasn't so sure. She knelt by Rusty, running her fingers through his fur, and noticed a faint smear of mud on his muzzle. Mud that smelled sharp and wet, like the earth beyond the garden. "He's been out there again," she murmured, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the oak tree loomed, its branches swaying faintly in the evening breeze, casting jagged shadows across the grass. That night, after the kids were tucked in and the house settled into silence, Jen lay awake, listening. Michael snored beside her, a low rumble that usually lulled her to sleep, but tonight her mind wouldn't rest. She heard it then, the soft pad of Rusty's feet crossing the kitchen, the creak of the back door they never locked. Slipping out of bed, she tiptoed to the window, peering through the glass. In the dim moonlight, she saw him, Rusty, moving with purpose, his head low as he crossed the yard toward the oak tree. He carried something in his mouth, a scrap of bread, maybe, or a bone from dinner, and disappeared into the shadows beneath the branches. Jen pressed a hand to her chest, her heart thudding. She wanted to wake Michael, to demand he come see, but something held her back. Instead, she watched, straining her eyes against the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw another shape, smaller, fleeting, darting near the tree, but the night swallowed it before she could be sure. When Rusty returned an hour later, he padded back to his basket, his tail low, and let out that same mournful sigh. Jen crept downstairs, kneeling beside him. "What are you doing out there, boy?" she whispered, stroking his head. He looked up at her, his brown eyes glistening, and she swore she saw a flicker of something. Grief, maybe, or a secret he couldn't tell. The next morning, she showed Michael the paw prints again, pointing out the smaller mark. "It's not just Rusty," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something else out there with him." Michael frowned, crouching to study the tracks, but he didn't answer. Outside, the oak tree stood silent, its roots buried deep in the earth, guarding whatever lay beneath. And in the quiet, Jen felt a question take root in her mind. What was Rusty searching for, and what had he found? The air hung thick with the scent of rain that evening, a heavy promise that rolled in from the forest beyond the little house. Jen stood at the sink, scrubbing dishes with a distracted rhythm, her eyes flicking to the window where the oak tree loomed against a sky bruised purple with storm clouds. The kids were upstairs, their laughter muffled as they played some noisy game with toy cars, but Jen barely heard them. Her mind was on Rusty, who'd been listless all day, his usual bounding energy replaced by a quiet slump in his basket, his ears drooping as if weighed down by an unseen burden. She tried coaxing him with a treat earlier, a scrap of bacon from breakfast, but he'd only sniffed it and turned away, his brown eyes clouded with something she couldn't name. Michael slumped in the armchair by the fireplace, nursing a beer and flipping through a worn paperback he hadn't touched in weeks. He'd been home for 2 days now, but the distance between them felt wider than ever. Jen set a plate down harder than she meant to, the clatter breaking the silence. "He's not eating, Mike," she said, her voice sharp with worry. "Rusty's not himself. I think he's sick." Michael glanced up, his brow creasing. "He's fine, Jen. Dogs get moody. Probably just misses chasing his own tail." His tone was dismissive, but Jen caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. She wiped her hands on a towel, crossing her arms. "This isn't moody. He's been sneaking out every night, coming back covered in mud, sighing like he's carrying the world. And those tracks." She pointed to the floor where she'd scrubbed away the latest paw prints that morning, the smaller, claw-like mark still etched in her mind. "Something's wrong, and you're just sitting there like it's nothing." Michael set his beer down, his jaw tightening. "What do you want me to do, Jen? Lock him in? He's a dog, not a prisoner. Maybe he's hunting rabbits or digging up old bones. Let him be." Their voices rose, a rare crack in the quiet they'd built around Marley's absence. Jen's hands clenched into fists. "He's not hunting rabbits. He's taking food, our food, and going out there." She gestured toward the window, where the first raindrops tapped against the glass. "I saw him last night with a piece of bread, heading straight for that damn tree. He's not right, Mike, and I'm tired of you shrugging it off." Michael stood, his chair scraping the floor. "Fine, you want me to check? I'll check. But don't expect me to play detective over a mutt with a snack obsession." Before Jen could snap back, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the house, followed by a sharp gust that rattled the windows. The lights flickered, and upstairs, Lily let out a startled yelp. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. "Great, storm's here. I'll deal with the kids." He trudged up the stairs, leaving Jen alone with the hum of the rain and Rusty's shallow breathing from his basket. She knelt beside him, brushing his fur. "What's out there, boy?" she whispered. He lifted his head, his nose twitching, then settled back with that same mournful sigh. Hours later, the storm had grown into a beast, wind howling through the trees and rain lashing the roof like fists. Jen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Michael's snores a jagged rhythm beside her. She'd almost drifted off when a faint sound snapped her awake. A weak, desperate scratching at the back door. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and slipped out of bed, pulling on a robe. Downstairs, she found Rusty, soaked to the bone, his golden fur plastered against his trembling frame. In his mouth, he clutched a broken chicken bone from dinner, the splintered end gleaming wetly in the dim light. "Rusty, what the hell?" she breathed, reaching for him. But he darted back, a low whine escaping his throat, and before she could grab his collar, he nosed the door open and bolted into the night.
Jenna's stomach dropped.
"Michael!" she shouted, racing to the stairs. He stumbled down, bleary-eyed, pulling on his boots. "What now?" he grumbled, but his face paled when he saw the open door and the muddy streaks Rusty had left behind. Jen pointed outside, where the rain fell in sheets, obscuring the yard. "He's gone again, and it's flooding out there. The creek's overflowing. I heard it on the radio. We can't let him stay out in this." Michael cursed under his breath, grabbing a flashlight from the counter. "Stay here with the kids," he said, his voice rough but firm. Jen shook her head, clutching his arm. "No, Mike, it's too dangerous. The water's rising fast." But he pulled free, yanking his coat from the hook. "I'll get him back. He's not dying out there because of some damn bone." He stepped into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Jen frozen in the kitchen, her hands trembling. Through the window, she watched the beam of his flashlight cut through the rain, a frail thread of light swallowed by the darkness. The wind screamed, bending the trees, and Jen's breath caught as she realized where Michael was headed, straight toward the oak tree, where Rusty had vanished into the shadows. She pressed a hand to the glass, her pulse racing. For a split second, between the flashes of lightning, she thought she saw something. A vague, shifting shape near the tree, too tall to be Rusty, too fleeting to be sure. Was it Michael or something else? She sank into a chair, staring at the empty basket, the muddy prints, the storm raging outside. Rusty was out there, risking his life for something she didn't understand, and now Michael was too. The house creaked under the storm's fury, and Jen whispered into the chaos. "What's calling you out there, Rusty?" The answer, she feared, was buried beneath that oak tree, and it wasn't just Marley's ghost. The storm roared like a living thing, its wind clawing at Michael's coat as he stumbled through the yard, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Rain stung his face, blurring his vision, but he pressed forward, the beams slicing through the downpour to catch glints of muddy water pooling across the grass. The creek beyond the garden had burst its banks, its swollen current roaring in the distance, and Michael's boots sank into the sodden earth with every step. He cursed under his breath, the cold seeping into his bones, but his eyes were fixed on the oak tree ahead, its massive silhouette swaying dangerously against the lightning-streaked sky. That's where Rusty had gone, and Michael wasn't about to let the damn dog drown out there over a chicken bone. The tree loomed closer now, its branches thrashing like the arms of some ancient beast caught in the storm's fury. Michael remembered the summer days when he'd sat beneath it, watching Marley sprawl out in the shade, Rusty tumbling over him in playful bounds. The doghouse he'd built still stood there, or had until tonight. As he neared, the flashlight caught a flicker of movement. Rusty, his golden fur plastered dark with mud, hunched near the base of the tree. The pup was digging, his paws churning the earth with a frantic rhythm, water swirling around his legs as he worked. In his mouth, the broken chicken bone gleamed faintly, dropped momentarily as he clawed deeper into the muck. "Rusty!" Michael shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. He staggered forward, slipping on the slick ground, and aimed the light at the hole Rusty had carved. The beam illuminated a shallow pit where the floodwaters had already begun their assault, washing away layers of soil to reveal the edge of something wooden. A corner of the box they'd buried Marley in, its splintered lid peeking through the mud. Michael's stomach lurched. He dug that grave himself 3 months ago, his hands shaking as he lowered Marley's stiff body into the earth, the old dog's collar jingling one last time before he covered it with dirt. Now, the flood was clawing it back, and Rusty seemed hell-bent on helping it along. "Get over here, you idiot," Michael yelled, lunging for Rusty's collar. But the dog dodged, a low growl rumbling in his throat, and returned to his task, paws scraping furiously at the sodden ground. Water lapped higher, soaking Michael's knees as he waded closer, and he saw what Rusty was after. The box was tilting now, its side exposed, and something glinted inside. Not just the collar, but a faint metallic sheen he couldn't place. Lightning flashed, painting the scene in stark white, and for a moment, Michael swore he saw more than mud in that hole. A shadow, a shape, something that didn't belong. He shook his head, blaming the rain and the dark, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Then came the sound. A sharp, splintering crack that cut through the storms in Michael's head snapped up as the oak tree groaned, its roots lifting from the earth like twisted fingers pulled free of a grave. The flood had undermined it, the soil too soft to hold its weight, and now it teetered, a massive branch creaking ominously above them. "Rusty, move!" he roared, throwing himself forward. He grabbed the dog's scruff, yanking him back just as the branch gave way, crashing down with a thunderous snap. It smashed into the hole, shattering the wooden box and sending a spray of mud and debris into the air. Michael hit the ground hard, Rusty pinned beneath his arm, both of them drenched and gasping as the tree settled with a final, shuddering groan. For a moment, there was only the rain, pounding relentlessly, and the ragged sound of Michael's breathing. He pushed himself up, spitting mud, and shone the flashlight at the wreckage. The branch had crushed what was left of Marley's grave, the box now a mess of broken planks scattered in the floodwater. Rusty whimpered, struggling free of Michael's grip, and nosed at the debris, his tail low. Michael wiped his face, his hands trembling. Not from the cold, but from the near miss. "You're gonna get us both killed," he muttered, but his voice cracked, and he couldn't tear his eyes from the hole. The light caught something, a glint of metal amid the splintered wood. It was Marley's collar, its tarnished tag twisted free, but beside it lay something else. A small, rusted object, half buried in the muck. A knife? A tool? Michael couldn't tell, but it wasn't anything he'd put in that box. Before he could reach for it, a strange sound pierced the air. A low, keening hiss, not quite wind, not quite animal, rising from the shattered grave. Rusty's ears flattened, and he backed away, a growl building in his chest. Michael froze, the flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam darting across the wreckage. Was it the storm playing tricks, or something else? Lightning flashed again, and in that fleeting glare, Michael saw it. A shadow moving near the tree, too tall for Rusty, too vague to be real. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving him blinking into the dark, his pulse racing. He grabbed Rusty's collar, dragging the dog back toward the house, his boots sloshing through the rising water. The rain swallowed the hiss, but it echoed in his mind, a question he couldn't shake. What had Rusty been digging for, and what had they just unleashed? Back at the house, Jen flung the door open, her face pale as she pulled them inside. "You're soaked. God, Mike, what happened?" she demanded, kneeling to wrap a towel around Rusty. Michael sank into a chair, the flashlight clattering onto the table, his eyes distant. "He was at the tree," he said hoarsely, "digging up Marley. And then the tree came down." He didn't mention the hiss, the shadow, the strange object. Not yet. But as Jen hugged Rusty, murmuring reassurances, Michael stared out the window at the oak, its broken form stark against the storm. Something was out there, something more than mud and memories. The kitchen was a mess of muddy footprints and damp towels the next morning, The storm's fury reduced to a drizzle that tapped faintly against the windows. Jen knelt by Rusty, rubbing his fur with a cloth, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. The dog lay still, his eyes half closed, exhausted from the night's ordeal, but alive. Thank God for that. Michael sat at the table, his coat still dripping onto the floor, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept, not after what he'd seen under the oak tree, and the weight of it pressed against his skull like a stone he couldn't shift. The broken box, the rusted object, that unearthly hiss. They churned in his mind, refusing to settle into anything he could explain. Jen glanced up, her voice soft but edged with worry. "He's okay, Mike, just tired. But what the hell happened out there? You look like you saw a ghost." She forced a small laugh, trying to lighten the air, but it died when she saw his face. Michael's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the mug until his knuckles whitened. "The tree came down," he said, his tone flat. "Rusty was digging at Marley's grave. Flood washed it up and he wouldn't stop. Damn near got us both crushed. He left it there, swallowing the rest, the shadow, the sound, the thing he couldn't name." Jen's hands stilled, the towel dropping to her lap. "Marley's grave?" she repeated, her voice cracking. "Why would he? God, Mike, why didn't you tell me he was out there digging him up?" She stood, crossing to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the oak tree, or what was left of it. Its massive trunk leaned drunkenly now, one side uprooted, the fallen branch a jagged scar across the yard. Michael didn't answer right away. He took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding him, but his eyes drifted to a memory he'd buried deeper than Marley. It had been a week ago, maybe two, he couldn't pinpoint it exactly. He'd caught Rusty pawing at the base of the oak one evening, just before dusk, his muzzle buried in the dirt. When Michael hauled him back, he'd noticed something odd. A small, curved bone poking through the soil, too thin to be from their kitchen scraps. He'd kicked it aside, figuring it was a rabbit or a squirrel Rusty had dragged home, and told himself it was nothing. But last night, seeing that box splintered open, the glint of something metallic beside Marley's collar, he wasn't so sure anymore. He'd buried Marley himself, his hands raw from the shovel, his eyes dry because he wouldn't let Jen see him break. He'd tossed in the collar, covered it with earth, and walked away. So what was that other thing? And why hadn't he checked closer? "Mike!" Jen's voice snapped him back. She was watching him now, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. "You're not telling me something. What happened out there?" Michael set the mug down, the clink loud in the quiet. "Nothing," he lied, meeting her gaze. "Just the storm. Tree fell, that's all." But Jen wasn't buying it. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Don't do that. Don't shut me out again. You've been like this since Marley died. Acting like it didn't happen, like I don't feel it too. If Rusty's hurting, if he's out there because of Marley, I deserve to know." Michael's chest tightened, a flare of guilt twisting with something darker. "He's a dog, Jen," he said, sharper than he meant. "He's not hurting. He's obsessed, stealing food, digging holes. Maybe he's gone half wild, I don't know. But I'm not losing sleep over it." Jen's eyes narrowed, hurt flashing across her face. "Half wild? He's not some stray, Mike. He's ours. He was Marley's. And you're the one who buried him out there. Did you even care?" The words hit like a slap, and Michael stood, his chair scraping back. "I cared enough to dig the damn hole," he shot back. "You think I wanted to? You think I liked it?" The air crackled between them, years of unspoken grief spilling out in jagged edges. Jen opened her mouth to argue, but a soft whine from Rusty cut her off. The dog lifted his head, staring at the back door, his ears twitching. Jen sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need to figure this out," she said, softer now. "He's not stopping, and if he's digging up Marley, there's a reason. I say we set up a camera, see what he's doing out there." Michael hesitated, his mind flashing to that rusted object, the hiss he couldn't unhear. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't expect much. He's probably just chasing ghosts. They rigged up an old night vision camera from the garage, mounting it on the porch to face the oak tree. Michael worked in silence, his hands steady but his thoughts racing. He hadn't told Jen about the bone he'd seen before, or the shadow last night, or the doubt gnawing at him now. What if he'd missed something when he buried Marley? What if that box held more than a dog's bones? He'd been in a haze that day, the kids crying inside, Jen sobbing on the porch. He just wanted it over. But now, with the flood tearing up the earth, with Rusty clawing at the past, he wasn't sure what he'd put in that ground. As night fell, the drizzle faded, leaving a damp stillness over the house. Jen tucked the kids in, her voice soft as she read them a story, while Michael sat by the window, watching the camera feed flicker to life on an old laptop. The oak tree filled the screen, its broken form a dark wound against the night. Rusty slept in his basket, but Michael knew it wouldn't last. He leaned back, his eyes heavy, and then he saw it. A faint scratch on the floor near the door, too deep for Rusty's claws, too precise to be random. His breath caught. Whatever was out there, it had been inside. The morning sun broke through the clouds in weak, watery streaks, casting a pale glow over the sodden yard. Jen stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the oak tree's wreckage. The floodwaters had retreated overnight, leaving behind a glistening sheen of mud and debris, but the earth around the tree looked wrong, fractured, like something had clawed its way up from below. Michael emerged from the house, the laptop tucked under his arm, his face drawn from a sleepless night spent watching the camera feed. Rusty trailed behind him, his tail low, his fur still matted with dried mud. Jen didn't look at Michael as he approached. The sting of their argument lingered, a quiet ache she didn't know how to mend. "Anything?" she asked, her voice tight. Michael set the laptop on the porch railing, flipping it open. "Yeah, you're gonna want to see this." His tone was clipped, but there was a tremor beneath it. Something Jen hadn't heard since the day Marley died. She stepped closer, peering at the grainy night vision footage as Michael hit play. The screen flickered, then steadied on the oak tree, its broken branch stark against the dark. For the first few minutes, nothing moved, just the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional drip of leftover rain. Then, a shape emerged from the shadows. Rusty, padding silently across the yard, a scrap of meat dangling from his jaws. Jen's breath caught as he reached the tree, dropping the meat into the muddy pit where Marley's box had been. But he didn't stop there. His paws dug into the earth, slow at first, then faster, churning the soil with a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. He paused to nudge the meat deeper, then resumed, his claws scraping against something hard. A plank from the shattered box, maybe. The camera caught his eyes glinting in the infrared light, wide and focused, like he was waiting for something. "He's been doing this every night," Michael muttered, his voice low. "Bringing food, digging, sitting there, like he's, I don't know, calling Marley back." Jen pressed a hand to her mouth, tears prickling her eyes. "He misses him," she whispered. "He's trying to." But Michael cut her off, fast-forwarding the footage. "That's not all. Watch this." The timestamp jumped to just past midnight, when the storm's last gasps had faded. Rusty was still at the pit, his head low, when the ground seemed to shift. A subtle crack, barely audible, but visible as a dark line split the mud around the tree's roots. He lunged at it, digging deeper, and then his paw hooked something. A scrap of fabric, tattered and gray, dragged free from the earth.
Jen frowned.
"What's that? That's not ours. We didn't bury anything like that with Marley." Michael's face darkened, his fingers hovering over the keys. "No, we didn't." He zoomed in, the image grainy but clear enough to show the fabric's edge, stained with something dark, like old blood, though time had faded it to a rusty brown. Rusty nosed at it, then backed away, a low whine crackling through the laptop speakers. Before Jen could speak, Michael stood, slamming the laptop shut. "Get your phone," he said, his voice hard. "Call the sheriff. Now."
Jen blinked, stunned.
"What? Mike, what are you?" He turned to her, his eyes sharp with something she hadn't seen in years, fear. That's not Marley's. And it's not some damn rag the wind blew in. Look at the ground, Jen. He pointed at the yard, where the crack in the earth had widened overnight, a jagged scar running from the tree's roots into the shadows of the forest. The flood didn't just dig up his grave. It dug up something else. I heard stories years ago when we bought this place. A kid went missing maybe 10, 12 years back. Never found him. People said he wandered into the woods. But Jen's stomach twisted, her hand fumbling for her phone. You think there's someone down there? Her voice shook, the words tasting bitter as they left her mouth. Michael didn't answer right away. He crouched by Rusty, who'd settled on the porch, staring at the tree with an eerie stillness. I don't know, he said finally, but Rusty does. He's been digging for weeks, Jen. Not just last night. I saw him before. Found a bone out there. Thought it was nothing. Now this. He gestured at the laptop, his hand unsteady. That fabric's old. Too old to be random. And it's under our tree. The air felt heavier now, the damp chill seeping into Jen's skin as she dialed the sheriff's number. Her mind raced. Marley's grave, Rusty's obsession, the flood tearing up the past. She remembered the rumors, faint whispers from neighbors when they'd moved in. A boy, barely 9, vanishing one summer, his parents pleading on the news. The case had gone cold, forgotten by everyone but the forest. Could it be? She shook her head, unwilling to believe it, but the stain on that fabric burned in her memory. While Jen spoke to the sheriff in halting sentences, something in our yard, under the tree. We don't know what it is. Michael paced, his boots thudding against the porch. He stopped, staring at the crack in the earth, and something clicked. A memory he'd buried deeper than Marley's box. The day he dug that grave, he'd hit something hard, a thud against the shovel he'd dismissed as a rock. He hadn't looked, hadn't wanted to, too lost in his own grief. Now he wondered, what had he covered up? The sheriff promised to send someone within the hour, and Jen hung up, her face pale. They're coming, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt by Rusty, stroking his head. What did you find, boy? Rusty whined, his eyes fixed on the tree, and Jen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Michael grabbed a flashlight, his jaw set. I'm going out there, he said, before they get here. I need to see it myself. Jen grabbed his arm. Mike, no, wait for them. But he pulled free, stepping into the yard, the crack in the earth gaping like a wound that wouldn't heal. The yard was eerily still as Michael trudged toward the oak tree, flashlight in hand, the damp earth sucking at his boots with every step. Jen watched from the porch, her heart pounding, one hand clutching Rusty's collar to keep him from following. The crack in the ground stretched wider now, a dark fissure glinting with leftover rainwater, and the air carried a faint, sour smell, like decay stirred up from somewhere deep. Michael's figure shrank against the tree's broken silhouette, and Jen fought the urge to call him back. She'd begged him to wait for the sheriff, but he'd shaken her off, his eyes hard with something she hadn't seen since Marley's death, a mix of guilt and determination she couldn't reach. Inside, the kids were still asleep, unaware of the chaos unfolding beyond their walls. Jen sank onto the porch steps, Rusty pressing against her side, his warmth a small comfort against the chill creeping up her spine. Her mind drifted back to Marley, his soft fur, his steady presence, the way he'd filled the empty spaces Michael left behind. When Michael was gone for weeks on those lumber jobs, Marley had been her shadow, curling up at her feet while she read to Tommy and Lily, his snores a quiet lullaby in the lonely nights. She'd cried into his fur more times than she could count, and he'd always stayed, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. But it was Rusty who'd broken her heart most when Marley slipped away. The young Labrador had lain beside his friend for days as Marley grew weaker, his breathing shallow, his eyes dimming. Jen remembered Rusty nudging him with a soft whine, as if begging him to get up, to chase one more squirrel under the oak tree. The day Marley died, Rusty had pressed his nose to the old dog's muzzle, a quiet, unspoken vow passing between them. Jen had seen it, Love, loyalty, a bond she couldn't fathom. And when Michael carried Marley out to bury him, Rusty had followed, sitting by the grave long after the dirt was packed down, his tail still as stone. Michael hadn't wanted her there that day. "Stay inside," he'd said, his voice rough, his hands gripping the shovel like a lifeline. Jen had argued, tears streaming down her face, but he'd turned away, digging in silence while she watched from the window. He'd built that doghouse for Marley years ago, a clumsy gift after missing Lily's first birthday, and Jen had forgiven him for it, because Marley had. But when he buried the old dog, he'd shut her out, leaving her to mourn alone with the kids. Now, seeing him out there again, digging into the past, she wondered what he'd been hiding. Not just from her, but from himself. Rusty whimpered beside her, snapping her out of the memory, and Jen stroked his head. "You're keeping his promise, aren't you?" she murmured, keeping him close. But her words faltered as she thought of the fabric on the camera feed, the blood-stained rag Rusty had unearthed. It didn't fit with Marley, didn't belong to their grief. Her mind spun to the rumors Michael had mentioned, the missing boy, the cold case that haunted the edges of their quiet town. Could it be true? Could something so dark have been buried under their tree all these years? Michael reached the pit now, kneeling beside the cracked earth, the flashlight beam darting across the wreckage. The broken box lay scattered, Marley's collar tangled in the mud, but he ignored it, his focus on the deeper hole Rusty had clawed open. He brushed away soil, his fingers uncovering more of the fabric. A torn sleeve, stiff with age, its edges frayed. His breath hitched as he pulled it free, the dark stain glaring under the light. He sat back on his heels, staring at it, and a memory flickered. A thud against his shovel that day, a sound he'd dismissed as a root or a stone. He hadn't looked, hadn't wanted to see. Now he cursed himself for it. Back on the porch, Jen's thoughts darkened. She remembered a dream from the night before, one she hadn't told Michael about. In it, Marley stood under the oak tree, his fur sleek and young again, but his eyes were wrong red, glowing, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He'd barked once, sharp and urgent, then turned and vanished into the ground. She'd woken in a cold sweat, dismissing it as grief playing tricks. But now, with that fabric in Michael's hands, the dream felt like a warning. Had Marley known something? Had Rusty sensed it too? Michael stood, shoving the fabric into his pocket, and turned back toward the house, his face pale even in the dim light. Jen met him halfway, Rusty trailing her, and grabbed his arm. "What is it?" she demanded. He hesitated, then pulled out the sleeve, holding it up. "This," he said, his voice low, "it's not ours, and it's not some animal's trash. I think it's been down there a long time." Jen's stomach dropped, her fingers brushing the stain. "The boy?" she whispered. Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "Maybe. I don't know. But I heard something that day, Jen, when I buried Marley. Something under the dirt. I didn't check."
Jenes eisweidend, enger flaring.
"You heard something and didn't tell me? Mike, you buried him. You buried whatever this is. And you kept it from me?" Michael flinched, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't know, Jen. I was a mess that day. You were crying, the kids were screaming, I just wanted it done. I thought it was nothing." She stepped back, shaking her head. "Nothing? And now Rusty's digging it up, and we've got this." She gestured at the sleeve, her voice breaking. "What if it's him, Mike? What if we've been living over a grave that's not just Marley's?" Rusty nudged her leg, whining, his eyes flicking to the tree. Jen knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly. "You've been trying to tell us." Michael watched them, the flashlight dangling at his side, and for the first time since Marley died, Jen saw something crack in his stoic mask. Regret, raw and unguarded. The sheriff would be here soon, but as they stood there, the oak tree's shadow stretching over them, Jen couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done with them yet. The sheriff's truck rolled up the muddy driveway just past noon, its tires crunching over the gravel as a faint mist hung over the yard. Jen stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly, watching two deputies climb out. Sheriff Danvers, a grizzled man with a permanent frown, and a younger officer she didn't recognize. Michael met them at the edge of the garden, the blood-stained sleeve clutched in his hand, his face a mask of tension. Rusty sat beside Jen, his ears twitching at the sound of boots on the ground, but his eyes stayed fixed on the oak tree, or what remained of it. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of answers neither Jen nor Michael was sure they wanted. Danvers tipped his hat, his voice gruff. "Got your call, Jen. Said you found something under that tree?" Michael stepped forward, holding out the sleeve. "This. Rusty dug it up last night. Flood pulled up the dirt and he went after it. It's not ours." Danvers took it, turning it over in his gloved hands, his frown deepening as he studied the dark stain. "Old," he muttered, passing it to the deputy, who slipped it into an evidence bag. "Could be anything, hunter's trash, kid's lost shirt. But we'll take a look. Where's the spot?" Michael led them to the cracked earth beneath the oak, the deputy's boots sinking into the mud as they surveyed the wreckage. Jen followed, tugging Rusty along, her stomach churning. The pit was wider now, the flood's retreat leaving jagged edges where the soil had split, and Marley's broken box lay scattered like bones picked clean. The younger deputy, a wiry man with sharp eyes, crouched by the hole, shining a flashlight into its depths. "Something's been digging here a while," he said, glancing at Rusty. "Not just the storm." Danvers nodded, his gaze shifting to Michael. "You buried your dog here, you said? When?" "3 months ago," Michael replied, his voice steady but clipped. "After he passed. Just him and his collar, nothing else." He paused, then added, "Or so I thought." Jen shot him a look, her jaw tightening. She hadn't forgiven him for hiding what he'd heard that day, the thud under the shovel, the secret he'd kept while she mourned alone. Danvers raised an eyebrow. "Thought? You got something to add, Mike?" Michael hesitated, then sighed. "When I dug the grave, I hit something. Sounded like a rock or metal. I didn't check. Wasn't in the mood to play archaeologist." The sheriff grunted, unimpressed, and motioned to the deputy. "Let's see what's down there." They unpacked shovels from the truck, and Jen stepped back, her hand tightening on Rusty's collar as the men began to dig. The sound of metal slicing into wet earth filled the air, each scrape a jolt to her nerves. She glanced at Michael, his face pale, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You should have told me," she said quietly, her voice sharp with hurt. "That day you shut me out, and now we're here, digging up God knows what because you didn't look." Michael's eyes met hers, shadowed with guilt. "I didn't know, Jen, I swear. I couldn't handle it." Before she could respond, the deputy let out a low whistle. "Sheriff, over here." He'd uncovered something. A small, muddy shape wedged beneath a plank from Marley's box. Danvers knelt, brushing away dirt with gloved fingers, and pulled it free. A child's shoe, its leather cracked and faded, laces rotted to threads. Jen's breath caught, a cold dread pooling in her chest. "That's not," she started, but Danvers held up a hand, his face grim. "It's old, real old. Matches the fabric, maybe." He turned to Michael. "You sure you didn't see anything else that day?" Michael shook his head, but his voice wavered. "No, just the dirt and Marley. But..." He trailed off, his mind flashing to the hiss he'd heard in the storm, the shadow that flickered in the lightning. He hadn't told Jen that part, hadn't told anyone, and now it gnawed at him, a doubt he couldn't bury. The deputy dug deeper, and the pit yielded another find. A rusted metal buckle, small enough to fit a child's belt, its edges worn but intact. Danvers bagged it, his expression darkening. "This ain't no coincidence," he said. "We've got a cold case. A boy, 9 years old, went missing round here a decade back. Never found him. If this is tied to that..." Jen's legs weakened, and she sank to the ground beside Rusty, her hands trembling. "Under our tree?" she whispered. "All this time." Rusty growled softly, his hackles rising as the deputies worked, his eyes locked on the hole. Michael knelt beside her, his voice low. "I didn't know, Jen. I'd have said something if I'd seen it. But Jen pulled away, her anger flaring. You didn't look, Mike. You didn't care enough to check. And now Rusty's the one dragging it up, risking his life for it. Her words cut, and Michael flinched, his hands balling into fists. Danvers stood, dusting off his gloves. We'll take this back, run some tests. Could be nothing, could be everything. Either way, this spot's a scene now. Don't touch it. He glanced at Rusty, who'd begun pacing, a low rumble in his throat. Your dog's got a nose for trouble, huh? Jen stroked Rusty's head, her voice shaking. He's not looking for trouble. He's looking for Marley. But as she said it, she wondered, had Rusty sensed more than Marley down there? Had he known all along? The deputies packed up, leaving the pit cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the breeze. Michael watched them go, the shoe and buckle burning in his mind. He turned to Jen, his voice rough. I messed up. I get it. But we're in this now together. Jen didn't answer, her eyes on Rusty, who stared at the tree with an intensity that chilled her. The oak's shadow stretched long and dark, and for a moment, she thought she heard it again. A faint hiss, carried on the wind, whispering from the cracked earth. The afternoon sun dipped low, painting the yard in muted gold as the sheriff's truck rumbled away, leaving behind a silence that felt too heavy for the little house. Jen stood by the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea, staring blankly at the yellow tape fluttering around the oak tree. The deputies had taken the sleeve, the shoe, the buckle, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't unsee, and promised answers soon. But the waiting gnawed at her, a restless ache that mingled with the grief she'd carried since Marley's death. Michael sat at the table, his head in his hands, the weight of his silence louder than any words. Rusty lay by the back door, his eyes fixed on the yard, a soft whine escaping him now and then. Jen set the mug down, her voice breaking the stillness. We can't just sit here, Mike. Rusty's still out of sorts. He hasn't eaten all day. Whatever's out there, it's tearing him up. Michael lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. What do you want me to do, Jen? The sheriff's got it now. We're done. But Jen shook her head, her jaw tightening. We're not done. He's not done. Look at him. He's waiting for something, and I can't stand it anymore. She crossed to the closet, rummaging through a box of old toys and blankets until her fingers brushed something soft. Marley's teddy bear. Its fur matted and faded, one eye missing from years of love. Michael stood, frowning. What are you doing? Jen held up the bear, her voice trembling. This was his favorite. You remember, he'd carry it everywhere, sleep with it by the fire. We almost threw it out after he died. But I couldn't. Maybe Rusty needs it now. Michael's expression softened, a flicker of memory breaking through his guarded wall. Yeah, he said quietly. He dragged that damn thing through the mud just to spite me. A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips, but it faded fast. You think it'll help? Jen shrugged, tears prickling her eyes. I don't know, but I have to try, for him. Dusk settled over the house as they stepped outside, the air cool and sharp with the scent of wet earth. Jen carried the teddy bear, Michael beside her with a flashlight, and Rusty trotted ahead, his tail wagging faintly for the first time in days. The oak tree loomed ahead, its broken trunk a jagged wound against the darkening sky, the yellow tape a stark warning they ignored. Rusty reached the pit first, nosing at the mud where he'd left his last offering. A scrap of meat from the night before, now half buried in the filth. He sat, his ears drooping, and let out a low, mournful sound that pierced Jen's heart. She knelt beside him, the damp seeping through her jeans, and placed the teddy bear in the mud next to the meat. Hey boy, she whispered, stroking his head. Marley's not gone, okay? He's still here with us, with you. Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pressed her forehead to Rusty's. You don't have to keep digging. He's not down there anymore. Rusty froze, his nose twitching as he sniffed the bear. Then, slowly, he opened his jaws and took it gently, like it was something fragile, something sacred. He lay down, curling his body around it, his paws resting on the matted fur, and Jen's sobs broke free, raw and unstoppable. Michael stood over them, the flashlight trembling in his hand, his throat tight. He'd built walls around Marley's death, around every damn thing that hurt, but watching Jen and Rusty in the mud, those walls cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I should have checked that day. Should have told you. I didn't want to see it. Any of it." Jen looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "You should have," she said. But there was no anger now, just exhaustion. "But I get it. I didn't want to see it either." She reached for his hand, and he took it, sinking to his knees beside her. The three of them huddled in the shadow of the tree. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, cold and sharp, rustling the tape and bending the grass. Jen shivered, and then she heard it. A faint clink against the oak's trunk. She turned, her breath catching as the flashlight beam swung upward, catching a glint of metal dangling from a broken branch. It was Marley's collar, its tarnished tag swaying in the breeze, somehow freed from the mud and hooked on the tree. "Mike!" she gasped, pointing. He stared, his eyes wide, and reached up to pull it free, the jingling sound cutting through the quiet like a memory come alive. "How the hell?" he started, but Jen grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "It's him. It's Marley." She clutched the collar, pressing it to her chest, and Rusty lifted his head, his ears perking as if he heard it too. Michael shook his head, his rational mind fighting the impossible. "The wind, Jen. It's just the wind." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The collar had been buried deep, too deep for a gust to drag it up like that. He looked at Rusty, curled around the teddy bear, and felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. They sat there in silence, the night closing in, the oak tree's shadow stretching over them like a shroud. Jen wiped her eyes, holding the collar tight, and whispered, "He's telling us it's okay." Michael didn't argue, he couldn't. For the first time since Marley died, he let himself feel it. The loss, the love, the weight of what they'd shared. Rusty sighed, resting his head on the bear, and Jen leaned against Michael, her tears soaking into his shirt. The pit gaped beside them, dark and unanswered. But for a moment, it didn't matter. They had this fragile, fleeting peace. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a pale wash of gray and pink that softened the harsh edges of the yard. Jen sat on the porch steps, a blanket draped over her shoulders, Marley's collar clutched in her hands. The cold metal pressed against her palms, its jingling tag a quiet echo of the night before. Beside her, Rusty slept fitfully, his head resting on the muddy teddy bear he'd carried back from the oak tree. Michael leaned against the railing, a steaming mug of coffee in his grip, his eyes tracing the yellow tape that still cordoned off the pit. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil, and for the first time in days, the house felt almost calm, almost. Jen glanced at Rusty, her voice soft. He didn't go out there last night. First time in weeks. She brushed a hand over his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Michael nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Yeah, guess the bear did something." His tone was gruff, but there was a warmth beneath it, a crack in the wall he'd built since Marley's death. Jen looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Did it help you too?" she asked quietly. Michael hesitated, then set the mug down, crouching beside her. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice low. "Seeing him with that thing, seeing you, I don't know, felt like we got a piece of Marley back." She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared grief lighter than it had been. But the peace was fragile, shadowed by the pit under the oak tree and the questions it held. The sheriff's words echoed in Jen's mind. The missing boy, the cold case, the possibility that their home had harbored a secret for a decade. She tightened her grip on the collar, her thumb tracing its edge. "What happens when they find out what's down there?" she asked. Michael's jaw tightened. "We deal with it, whatever it is." Before he could say more, Rusty stirred, his ears twitching as he lifted his head. He nosed the teddy bear, then stood, padding toward the edge of the porch. Jen frowned, following his gaze to the oak tree. The morning light revealed something new. A small mound of fresh dirt beside the pit, not there the night before. Rusty whined, his tail wagging faintly, and bolted down the steps, the bear still clamped in his jaws. "Rusty!" Jen called, but he didn't stop, trotting straight to the mound and dropping the bear beside it. He began to dig, his paws working the soft earth with a gentle rhythm, nothing like the frantic clawing of nights past. Michael grabbed the flashlight still on the railing from last night and followed Jen close behind. They reached the tree just as Rusty finished. A shallow hole, barely a foot deep, carved into the mud. He picked up the teddy bear, placed it carefully inside, and pushed the dirt back over it with his nose, covering it until only a small patch of fur peeked through. Then he lay down, resting his head on the mound, his eyes half closed, a soft huff escaping him. Jen knelt beside him, tears welling up again. "He's burying it," she whispered, her voice thick. "He's saying goodbye." Michael crouched next to her, his hand on Rusty's back. "Or keeping it safe," he said, his tone uncertain. "Maybe he's not letting go, just holding on different." Jen looked at him, then at the mound, and felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or peace. "Either way, he's not digging for Marley anymore," she said. Rusty sighed, curling tighter around the spot, and Jen smiled through her tears. "He's found his place." The sight of him there, calm at last, eased the ache in her chest, a balm against the chaos of the past days. But the calm shattered with the distant wail of a siren. Jen's head snapped up as the sheriff's truck rolled back into view, followed by another vehicle, a sleek black van with no markings. Danvers climbed out, his face grimmer than before, and waved them over. "Found something," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. Michael stood, helping Jen to her feet, and they approached, Rusty trailing behind, his ears perked. The deputies were unloading equipment. Shovels, a metal detector, a camera, and Jen's stomach twisted. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Danvers held up a plastic bag. Inside it a small, crumpled piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. "Came from that shoe," he said. "Lab pulled it out this morning. Writing's faint, but it says, 'Don't forget.'" Jen's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael frowned, peering at the bag. "Don't forget what?" Danvers shook his head. "Don't know yet. Could be a note, a kid's scribble, could be nothing. But with the shoe, the buckle, the fabric, we're digging deeper. This is a full scene now." Jen glanced at the pit, the cracked earth gaping like a wound, and felt a chill that wasn't from the morning air. "Under our tree," she murmured, her voice trembling. All this time, Michael put an arm around her, his grip firm. "We'll get through it," he said, but his eyes betrayed his doubt. Rusty sat by the mound, watching the deputies with a quiet intensity, and Jen wondered, what had he known? What had he guarded? As the men began their work, a faint rainbow arched across the sky, its colors soft against the gray clouds, a fragile promise after the storm. Jen clung to it, to the hope it offered, but the sound of shovels biting into the earth pulled her back. Danvers turned to them, his voice low. "Might want to keep the kids inside today. This could take a while." Jen nodded, her hand tightening on Michael's, and they headed back to the house, Rusty trailing behind. But as they reached the porch, she heard it again. A faint hiss, rising from the pit, carried on the breeze like a whisper from the past. The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the yard as the deputies finished their work. Jen stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, Marley's collar dangling from her fingers like a talisman. Beside her, Michael leaned against the railing, his face etched with exhaustion but softer now, the hard edges worn down by the day's revelations. Rusty lay at their feet, his head resting on the spot where he'd buried the teddy bear that morning, his breathing steady and calm. The oak tree, broken but still standing, loomed over the scene, its roots exposed like veins torn from the earth. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a silent marker of the truth they'd uncovered. Sheriff Danvers approached, his boots caked with mud, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. Behind him, the deputies loaded a small metal box into the black van. A grim find pulled from the pit after hours of digging. "It's done," Danvers said, wiping his brow. "Bones, human, kid-sized. Lab'll confirm, but with the shoe, the buckle, the note. It's him. The boy from 10 years back. Been under that tree all this time." Jen's stomach twisted, a wave of nausea hitting her. "Under our tree," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We've been living here. Raising our kids here. Over that?" Danvers nodded, his eyes steady. "Looks like it. No fault of yours, happened long before you moved in. Old tenant, maybe, or someone passing through. We'll dig into the records, see who owned this place back then. But you're clear, nothing ties you to it." Michael put a hand on Jen's shoulder, his grip firm. "And the fabric? The stuff Rusty found?" Danvers shrugged. "Part of his clothes, probably. Flood loosened it up and your dog did the rest. Lucky he's persistent. Might have stayed buried forever otherwise." Jen knelt beside Rusty, stroking his fur, her tears falling silently. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. "You weren't just digging for Marley." Rusty lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, she swore she saw understanding there. A quiet acknowledgement of the burden he'd carried. Michael crouched next to her, his voice rough. "He's a hell of a dog. Saved more than just Marley's memory." Jen nodded, wiping her eyes, and leaned into him, the warmth of his presence grounding her against the cold reality sinking in. Danvers cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We'll need statements from you both, routine stuff, and this spot's off limits till we wrap up. Might be a few days." He glanced at the oak, its broken trunk a stark silhouette against the fading light. "Tree's a loss, though. Might want to think about cutting it down." Jen shook her head, her voice firm.
No.
"It stays. It's part of us now, part of them." Danvers raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, tipping his hat as he turned back to the truck. "Your call. We'll be in touch." The van pulled away, leaving the yard quiet again, the hum of its engine fading into the forest. Jen stood, clutching the collar, and looked at Michael. "We're okay, right?" she asked, her voice small. He pulled her close, his arms steady around her. "Yeah, we're okay." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. The pit had taken something from them, a piece of their peace, but it had given something back too. A chance to face the past, to heal what they'd buried with Marley. Rusty rose, stretching, and padded to the porch steps, settling down with a contented huff. As twilight deepened, Jen slipped the collar into her pocket, her fingers brushing against it one last time. She'd keep it. Maybe hang it by the fireplace, a quiet tribute to Marley and the boy they'd never known. But as she turned to go inside, a soft sound stopped her. A faint chirp, high and clear, cutting through the dusk. She looked up, and there, perched on the oak's highest unbroken branch, sat a small bird, its feathers glinting in the last light. It tilted its head, letting out another chirp, and Jen's breath caught. It was the same call Marley used to answer when she whistled for him. A sharp, playful note he'd bark back at, tail wagging. "Mike!" she whispered, grabbing his arm. He followed her gaze, frowning. "What?" The bird chirped again, hopping along the branch, and Jen's heart skipped. "That sound, it's him. It's Marley." Michael squinted, his rational mind kicking in. "It's a bird, Jen. Probably a sparrow. They're all over these woods." But even as he said it, he heard it, the exact pitch, the rhythm Marley had echoed in their games years ago. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Hell of a coincidence. Jen didn't argue. She didn't need to. Whether it was Marley or just a trick of the evening, it felt like a goodbye, a final note of peace after the storm. The bird flitted away, disappearing into the trees, and Jen leaned against Michael, her tears dry now. "He's okay," she said softly. "They both are." Michael nodded, his arm tightening around her, and they headed inside, Rusty trailing behind, his steps light. The oak stood silent in the gathering dark, its roots still tangled in the earth, its branches reaching for a sky streaked with stars. The pit was empty now, its secrets laid bare, but the tree held its own echoes of Marley, of Rusty, of a boy lost and found. Jen paused at the door, glancing back one last time, and whispered, "Thank you." For what? She wasn't sure. For closure, for hope, for the strange, stubborn love that had brought them here. The night swallowed her words, but the quiet felt full, alive with something she couldn't name.